On a night colder than death itself, the screams of the Bellamy family froze in the wind. Imagine it, an entire dynasty of cruelty, locked inside their own tomb of ice, pounding against stone walls while the storm buried their voices. But the strangest part isn't how they died. It's what happened next. Because when dawn broke over Natchez in 1841, there was no slave girl's body in that frozen chamber. 17-year-old Eliza Monroe, condemned to perish, had vanished, and what she left behind would become legend. A rusty key swinging gently from the latch, and whispers that the ice had chosen its own mistress. The Ice Witch of Natchez. But I'm not here to tell you a ghost story. No. This is something darker. Because Eliza's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy wrapped in folklore, it was a fracture in history, a hole in the veil that separates official records from forbidden truth. What happened to Eliza? Did she escape into freedom? Was she claimed by forces that hunger in the cold? Or, most disturbingly, was her vanishing the price of a bargain struck in shadows, buried so deep that only fragments remain in whispers and rumors nearly 2 centuries later? Before we go further, I want you to pause, look around the room you're in right now. Think about the warmth that surrounds you, the electric hum of comfort, the certainty that your body will not be broken by those who believe they own you. Then imagine all of it stripped away in an instant, reduced to property, punished for breathing too freely. That was Eliza's world, and when she walked out of the storm, she wasn't just escaping a plantation, she was carrying forbidden knowledge, the kind of knowledge that makes men in power tremble. That's why this story still matters, because it's not about one girl, it's about what happens when a system of cruelty underestimates the human mind and the human will to turn oppression into a weapon. So ask yourself, if a girl born into chains could rewrite her destiny, what excuse do you have for living asleep? This is the descent we're beginning, you and I, down the rabbit hole, deeper than history wants you to go, because every empire is built on secrets, and every secret carries a price. Tonight you're going to learn what it means to see beneath the mask of power, and once you see it, you'll never unsee it. But first, I need you to ground yourself in this moment. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching this from? What part of the world are you in as you hear the story they tried to bury? Because the Ice Witch of Natchez isn't just folklore, it's a mirror. And when you stare into it long enough, it starts staring back. The Bellamy plantation was not just a house and fields, it was an empire of suffering disguised as prosperity. 4,000 acres of Mississippi bottomland, a manor house gleaming white against the black soil, and 200 enslaved bodies whose blood and bones fertilized the wealth of one family. Harrison Bellamy, the master of this realm, carried cruelty in his veins like an inheritance. His grandfather had built the estate on the backs of men and women stolen from Africa, and Harrison sharpened that legacy into something even more vicious. His rage was a weapon, and his slaves were the target practice. Catherine, his wife, seemed delicate at first glance. Porcelain skin, fragile wrists, the kind of beauty men described as angelic, but behind her frailty was something sharper than any whip: words. She could slice flesh from the soul with a single phrase, strip dignity from a human being until they begged for pain over humiliation. And she taught her children to follow her example. Robert, only 12, had already learned to devise punishments more creative than his father's drunken beatings. He delighted in the screams of animals, a rehearsal for the cruelty he'd inflict on humans. The twins, Margaret and Michael, just 10, turned torment into play. They mocked, they tricked, they whispered horrors into the ears of house servants until tears flowed, and then they laughed at the spectacle. It was into this theater of cruelty that Eliza Monroe was born. Her mother died giving her life, and her father, another enslaved man, was broken under the lash in the cotton fields. She never knew his face, only the scars on his back that other slaves described in whispers. Raised by old Sarah, the cook, Eliza learned early that survival was not just about obeying. It was about learning, listening, storing fragments of forbidden knowledge in her mind until they became weapons sharper than steel. Sarah had a secret gift for her: literacy. a crime punishable by mutilation or death. In hidden corners, by the dim light of stolen candles, Eliza traced words on scraps of discarded newspapers. At first, it was just sounds and letters, but soon she could read sentences, then entire articles, then the financial ledgers she glimpsed when cleaning the master's study. She saw how money flowed, how crops were sold, how human beings were priced and traded like cattle. She memorized details, routes, names, debts, weaknesses. Every secret she consumed added another piece to a puzzle no one believed she was capable of solving. By 15, Eliza had been pulled from the fields and placed in the main house. A promotion, they called it. In truth, it was another layer of torment. She scrubbed floors beneath Catherine's gaze, poured wine for Harrison's guests, endured the children's sadistic games. But she also overheard their private conversations. She listened to the drunken boasts of overseers, the anxieties whispered between planters about cotton prices, the carelessly revealed fears of men who thought themselves untouchable. To Eliza, it was all information, power, waiting to be used. And then came the ice. The winter of 1841 did not arrive gently. It stormed into Mississippi like a curse, freezing the river, suffocating crops, isolating the plantation under a shell of frost. And in this unnatural season, the Icehouse became the center of Eliza's existence. Carved into the earth, fortified with stone, it was a chamber of perpetual winter, a place where breath turned to fog and skin cracked from exposure. Catherine, with her serpentine cruelty, made sure it became Eliza's punishment ground. Day after day, thinly dressed, Eliza was forced to work in the freezing dark. Her body ached, her lips turned blue, but her mind sharpened. In solitude, away from the overseer's constant surveillance, she found clarity. She learned how the ice circulated air, how shadows fell in the chamber, how to endure when every nerve screamed surrender. She began to hide small supplies, food scraps, matches, cloth, in corners no master would think to check. The Icehouse was supposed to break her. Instead, it became her fortress. And this is where the story begins to twist, because Eliza was not only enduring the ice, she was mastering it. Watching, calculating, waiting. February 1841 arrived like a curse carved from the sky itself. Winds howled across the Mississippi Delta, bending trees to their knees. Snow smothered the ground until the world seemed drained of color. A vast white wasteland where even sound felt muffled, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. For the Bellamy plantation, it was both inconvenience and opportunity. Steamboats were trapped in ice, trade routes froze, neighbors became unreachable, and within that isolation cruelty grew bold. There would be no visitors to intervene, no escapees who could be pursued easily through the blinding storm. It was a season where masters could act without consequence, and Harrison Bellamy intended to. Eliza had been enduring her Icehouse duty for weeks, stripped of warmth as punishment for what Catherine described as impertinence. The truth was smaller, crueler. She had dared to flinch, visibly, when young Robert crushed a kitten's fragile body for amusement. That twitch of disgust was enough to mark her as rebellious. For Catherine, it was disrespect. For Harrison, it was defiance. For Robert, it was a challenge to his dominance. And so the ice became her cage, a punishment ground where suffering was measured in frostbite and numbness. But the storm of February the 14th, the coldest blizzard anyone in Natchez could remember, gave Harrison a new idea. The family was gathered in the parlor that night, fire roaring, brandy flowing, when the conversation turned to Eliza. Harrison's voice, thick with drink, growled about her uppity spirit. Catherine, ever the strategist of cruelty, suggested a lesson severe enough to etch obedience into her very bones. "Lock her in the Icehouse overnight," she said sweetly, "with nothing but the clothes on her back." Robert's eyes lit with excitement. The twins giggled, already imagining the spectacle. Harrison slammed his fist down in agreement. "Yes, let her see what real cold feels like. By dawn she'll either be broken or buried." The decision was sealed in laughter, in clinking glasses, in the grotesque delight of a family so numb to human suffering they mistook murder for entertainment. Outside, the storm screamed, rattling shutters and choking the world in snow. Inside, Eliza moved silently, carrying trays, clearing dishes, her ears tuned to every word. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something sharper, calculation. She had spent months inside that chamber. She knew its walls, its locks, its breathing vents, better than Harrison himself. They believed they were choosing her death. What they had chosen was their own tomb. The night wore on. The fire dwindled. Harrison pulled on his heavy coat, Catherine draped herself in furs, and the children bundled with scarves and mittens. They were eager, hungry to watch the ritual unfold. They led Eliza through knee-deep snow, their lanterns swaying, their laughter torn away by the wind. She walked in silence, her thin dress clinging to her shivering frame, her eyes lowered in feigned submission, but behind that mask, her mind burned with precision. The Icehouse loomed like a crypt against the storm. Its wooden door groaned open, exhaling a wave of frozen air so sharp it felt like knives against skin. The family filed inside, circling Eliza, explaining her punishment with theatrical cruelty. Harrison boomed about teaching gratitude. Catherine leaned close, stripping away her shawl with delicate malice. Robert shoved her toward the center of the chamber, his voice cracking with excitement. The twins sang a cruel rhyme about her freezing to death before dawn. And then Eliza spoke, her first words since entering. Soft, calm, almost concerned. She asked if the family would be safe walking back through the storm with temperatures dropping and the wind still rising. Her tone disarmed them. For a moment, even Harrison paused, caught off guard. Catherine laughed it off, boasting of their coats, their warm home. The children chimed in, parroting their parents' pride, and that was when Eliza moved. Lightning quick, silent as a ghost, she darted toward the heavy door. Before their laughter turned to comprehension, she was outside, slamming the timber shut. The iron key scraped in the lock. A thunderous click. The Bellamy family was sealed in their own frozen crypt. Their roars shook the walls. Threats, curses, promises of mercy screamed through the wood. But Eliza was already gone. Her stolen coat pulled tight, her bag of hidden supplies slung across her shoulder. Behind her, the storm howled louder than any voice. The Bellamys had chosen her tomb. Instead, they had built their own. The moment the door slammed and the lock thundered into place, Eliza did not hesitate. She didn't linger to savor their panic, didn't waste time with revengeful words. That would come later in silence, in the knowledge that their screams would be swallowed by the frost. She turned her back on the Icehouse and moved swiftly toward the main house, her body hunched against the storm, every step chosen with purpose. This was not escape in panic. It was execution of a plan she had been constructing in secret for years. Inside the great house, the fire still smoldered in the parlor, flames casting long shadows across empty chairs. For the first time in her life, Eliza entered those rooms not as property, but as their master. She moved quickly, her breath sharp, her eyes cold. She knew what she needed, and she knew exactly where to find it. From Harrison's study, she claimed his gold coins and paper money. She took his ledger, not for what it contained, but for the seals and signatures she had memorized, proof of ownership that could be twisted, forged, rewritten. She had studied his handwriting until she could imitate it perfectly, down to the arrogant curl of his letters. Power, hidden in ink and parchment, was now hers to wield. From Catherine's chambers, she stripped the wardrobe of warm clothing, coats lined with fur, sturdy boots, fine gloves, symbols of status for Catherine, but for Eliza they were weapons against the cold and camouflage for the journey ahead. She wrapped herself in layers of stolen warmth, each garment a reminder, I am no longer your possession. From the children's rooms, she gathered trinkets of value, jewelry, silver keepsakes, small treasures that could be traded discreetly for food or safe passage. Even their toys, gilded with wealth, became resources in her hands. Where the Bellamy children had once mocked her with cruel games, their belongings would now sustain her escape. But it was in the record room that Eliza performed her most dangerous work. Candles flickered, their light quivering against shelves stacked with documents, birth records, purchase receipts, property deeds, every transaction of human life catalogued in ink. She found her own name there, written coldly among the Bellamy possessions. Property, item, value. She stared at it, not with sorrow, but with steel in her heart. And then she changed it. With careful strokes of pen and ink, she altered her identity. Eliza Monroe, slave, became Elizabeth Washington, free woman of New Orleans. She copied Harrison's hand, applied stolen seals, manufactured a freedom purchased not by mercy, but by cunning. If questioned, her papers would withstand casual scrutiny, and in a world built on appearances, appearances could mean survival. Through it all, the storm outside masked the sounds of the family's descent into panic. Their screams, their pounding fists, their threats, all muted by snow and stone. Eliza heard fragments carried on the wind, but they did not slow her hands. She felt no triumph, no guilt, only clarity. They had chosen to weaponize the ice against her. She had simply turned the weapon in their direction. Before dawn, she moved to the stables. The horses, restless in the storm, stamped and whinnied as she approached, but one recognized her. Lightning, the mare she had cared for during her house duties. A sleek creature with fire in its muscles, loyal not to the Bellamys, but to the voice that had whispered comfort in stolen moments. Lightning nuzzled her shoulder, accepting her as rider. By the time the first light broke over the frozen delta, Eliza was mounted and ready. Behind her the plantation lay silent, its masters entombed in ice, its empire of cruelty leaderless. Before her the road stretched toward Natchez, toward the river, toward freedom. Her heart pounded not with fear, but with something new, power. For the first time in 17 years, Eliza was not surviving someone else's design. She was executing her own. The first rays of dawn broke across Mississippi, pale and unforgiving, washing the land in shades of silver and ice. Trees bent beneath the weight of frost, their branches creaking like bones ready to snap. The earth was buried under white silence, and in that silence rode a girl who was no longer a slave. Eliza urged Lightning forward, the mare's hooves crunching through snow, each strike echoing in the hollow emptiness of the delta. Her breath rose in clouds, mingling with the horse's steam, as though two spirits fled together through the frozen world. Behind her, the Bellamy estate loomed in shadow. The slaves stirred in their quarters, believing their masters still slept in comfort. None yet knew that the house of cruelty had collapsed in a single night. The family that had ruled with whips and words were now prisoners of the very ice they thought they controlled. But Eliza did not turn back. She could not. Freedom was not found in looking behind. It lived in the horizon ahead, where the roads twisted toward Natchez and the riverboats that could carry her north, away from bondage, into a world she had only dared to imagine. The storm had not broken. Winds howled like demons across the fields, cutting against her face, clawing at her stolen coat. Snow whipped in spirals, reducing the world to a blur of white and shadow, yet she pressed on, her mind sharper than the cold, her body driven by a force greater than exhaustion. For every lash she had witnessed, every scream she had endured, every humiliation she had swallowed, she rode harder. She was not escaping. She was reclaiming. Hours passed. The plantation fields gave way to forest, black trees clawing upward like skeletal hands. Lightning's hooves stumbled in drifts, but the mare pressed forward, muscles quivering, guided by the steady hand of the girl on her back. Eliza whispered to her, not words of command, boo, of kinship, two creatures once bound, now breaking free together. But in the silence between gusts of wind, Eliza began to hear something else. A whisper. Not from the woods, not from the wind, but from inside her mind, or perhaps beyond it. A voice cold and ancient, like frost spreading across glass. The stories Sarah had once murmured to the children in secret came rushing back. Of spirits in the ice, of the land itself remembering blood spilled upon it, of women who vanished in storms and returned changed, carrying secrets not meant for mortal ears. Eliza tightened her grip on Lightning's reins, shaking off the chill crawling her spine. Was it imagination, the trick of exhaustion and cold? Or had something in that chamber, something older than the Bellamy's cruelty, taken notice when she turned the ice against her captors? Legends were born that morning. By the time neighbors discovered the Bellamy's frozen corpses, the story would already be whispering through Natchez. A slave girl who vanished into the storm, a family sealed in ice by hands unseen, a witch, they would call her, a spirit of vengeance carved from snow and shadow. But Eliza was no witch. She was something far more dangerous. She was a mind awakened, a will sharpened by suffering, a human being who had mastered the art of turning chains into keys. Still, she felt the legend following her, like a second shadow. Every gust of wind sounded like her name spoken in a voice not her own. Every glance over her shoulder revealed only white emptiness, yet her instincts whispered that she was not entirely alone. The Bellamys were dead or dying, but the storm had claimed her as its child, marking her path with mystery and fear, and that too was power. For a fugitive, fear could be as protective as armor. If men believed she was untouchable, more than human, they would hesitate before chasing her. By midday, Eliza had ridden 30 miles, slipping through back roads and hidden trails known only to those who had listened, who had watched, who had memorized maps in silence while pretending not to see. Every step carried her further into forbidden territory, places where the reach of the Bellamys was fading, where her stolen papers and stolen courage could mean survival. But survival would not be enough. Deep in her chest, Eliza knew it. She was not running simply to live. She was running to transform, to shed the name that had been shackled to chains, to claim a new identity forged in fire and frost. The world would call her a witch, a fugitive, a ghost. She would call herself free. And yet, freedom always demands a price. By nightfall, the storm had consumed the land completely. Darkness pressed against the world, not soft like velvet, but heavy and merciless, swallowing even the faintest traces of the road. Snow stung Eliza's face, needles of ice cutting into her skin, as though the storm itself resented her survival. Lightning faltered, exhausted, her flanks trembling with every step. Eliza knew the mare could not endure much longer without rest and warmth. She scanned the white void for refuge, and then, like a miracle disguised as ruin, she saw it. An abandoned cabin crouched at the edge of a tree line, its roof sagging, its walls half buried in drifts. The windows were black, the door ajar, as if waiting for her. She dismounted, her body stiff with cold, her legs nearly buckling as her boots sank deep into snow. The mare nickered, steam rising from her nostrils, and Eliza whispered softly, stroking her muzzle before guiding her inside the half-sheltered barn attached to the cabin. There was no hay, no fodder, but there was roof above, and that was enough. Eliza stepped into the cabin itself, and for the first time since the Icehouse, she was truly alone. The air was stale, carrying the faint rot of years without human touch. A broken chair lay on its side. Ashes, long dead, filled the fireplace. She searched quickly, methodically, pulling broken wood into a pile, striking flint against her stolen matches. When the flame caught, it spread like revelation, painting the cabin's walls in trembling orange. The warmth reached her fingers slowly, painfully, each nerve screaming awake as if scalded. She leaned close, cradling the fire as though it were a newborn child, her chest heaving. This was not comfort. It was survival purchased with stolen time. She knew it. Tomorrow men might already be whispering in Natchez about the vanished girl, about the family not seen since last night. Trolls would be formed. Hunters would ride. But tonight, in this hollow cabin, Eliza had a different battle. Not against masters, but against herself, against the cold, against fear, against the old voices that whispered she was nothing more than property fleeing into the storm. She spread the documents she had altered, holding them up to the firelight. Elizabeth Washington, the name read, inked in Harrison's arrogant hand, her hand, now. A free woman, traveling north to join relatives in St. Louis. The seal looked authentic enough. The handwriting matched. Still, she studied every line, rehearsing every detail until she could recite it like scripture. Lies were only dangerous if you forgot them. In a world built on appearances, she had made herself real. But as the fire warmed her body, another chill spread through her mind. She remembered the sound of the key turning in the Icehouse, the silence that followed when the Bellamys realized their fate. She remembered Harrison's fists against the door, Catherine's shrill pleas, Robert's curses, and she remembered her own footsteps walking away, steady, unbroken, as their voices faded into incoherent madness. She felt no guilt, she felt no joy. What she felt was something stranger, a weight, yes, but also a power. She had chosen their end, she had rewritten the story, and that realization was more terrifying than the storm, because it meant she was not simply escaping, she was becoming. Old Sarah had once warned her, "The world don't fear chains, child. It fears a mind that knows it's free." Eliza whispered those words into the fire, her breath mingling with the smoke, as if speaking them aloud sealed something inside her. The storm clawed at the cabin's walls, howling like a living beast, but she did not flinch. She stared into the flames and saw not weakness, not flight, but transformation. When dawn came, she would ride again, northward, toward Natchez, toward the river, toward whatever waited. But tonight, inside that crumbling shelter, Eliza shed her old skin. The slave girl had died in the Icehouse. What remained was something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. And somewhere deep in the storm, the land itself seemed to recognize it. By the third day, Eliza reached the outskirts of Natchez. The storm had weakened, but its scars still covered the land. Trees splintered, roofs collapsed, livestock frozen in fields like statues of suffering. The town stirred cautiously, its citizens whispering of God's wrath, of omens in the snow, but beneath those murmurs, another story was spreading, carried on trembling lips like contraband. The Bellamys were dead. The tale moved faster than Eliza's horse could run. A neighbor had braved the storm to check on them, only to find the family entombed in the Icehouse, faces twisted in terror, fingers bloodied from clawing at wood, their fine clothes stiff with frost. The horror of it was enough to silence even the boldest tongues. But horror alone could not explain what had happened, and so people filled the silence with invention. They said the Bellamys had crossed a spirit, that their cruelty had conjured vengeance from the storm. Some whispered that a slave girl had been the instrument, that she had walked into the blizzard untouched while her masters froze in their own house. A ghost in flesh, a witch made of ice and shadow. The Ice Witch of Natchez, they named her. Eliza, riding cloaked and hooded along the back roads, heard fragments of these whispers when she neared the taverns, when she passed clusters of men repairing fences or burying frozen cattle. She kept her eyes low, her face hidden, but inside she studied every word. The legend was not her enemy, it was her shield. The more people believed she was more than mortal, the less likely they would be to hunt her with ordinary conviction. Fear was more potent than any lock. Still, she tread carefully. Natchez was a place of danger for a woman alone, doubly so for one whose skin marked her as fugitive, regardless of papers. She stabled Lightning in the yard of a sympathetic freedman, an old acquaintance of Sarah's, who owed no loyalty to the Bellamys and asked no questions. From him, she learned the first ripples of opportunity. The riverboats were running again, slowly breaking through ice. Passage north would soon be possible. But opportunity came shadowed by risk. Patrols had already been raised, not to find Eliza by name, but to seize on fear. Any runaway near Natchez that week would be hunted with double cruelty, for men love nothing more than to cage what they cannot explain. If Eliza misstepped, if she exposed herself before her legend had matured into untouchable myth, she would be dragged back not as a witch, but as a runaway girl in chains. So she wove her disguise with care. She wore Catherine's fur-lined cloak, her face veiled in its hood. She carried Harrison's forged papers, folded neatly against her chest. When questioned, she spoke little, enough to suggest the refinement of a free woman traveling under hardship. She purchased bread and dried meat with Robert's stolen coins, each exchange practiced and exact, never lingering long enough for suspicion. Yet everywhere she walked, she felt eyes following, not just of men, but of the story itself. Her reflection in windows looked altered, harder, older, as though the storm had carved her face into something strangers could not easily forget. At night, in the freedman's loft where she slept, she dreamed of frost spreading across her skin, of voices in the wind calling her name in tones both worshipful and accusing. The girl who had once been Eliza Munro was gone. The woman walking through Natchez wore another name, another mask, and carried within her the weight of two truths. She was both fugitive and phantom, hunted and untouchable. The legend of the Ice Way, which had been born, and Eliza, whether she liked it or not, would have to learn how to live inside her own myth. The Mississippi lay before her like a black serpent breaking free from ice, its waters sluggish yet alive, carrying fragments of snow downstream. Riverboats clustered along the Natchez docks, chimneys coughing smoke, decks bustling with workers hauling crates and barrels. Commerce was returning, tentative but desperate, for trade could not remain frozen forever. Among those boats, Eliza's escape waited, if she could pass unseen through the eyes of men trained to measure worth by color, by class, by chains. She walked with calm precision, cloak drawn tight, hood shadowing her face. Harrison's papers pressed against her chest like armor. She had studied them until the words etched themselves in her bones. Elizabeth Washington, free woman of New Orleans, traveling northward to St. Louis to join kin. The lies tasted bitter, but they were her only weapon. At the gangway of the River Queen, a stout vessel with paddle wheels as broad as cottages, she approached the clerk, a man of red cheeks and cold eyes, his hands ink-stained from ledgers, his voice clipped with suspicion. "Papers," he barked, before she could even speak. Eliza handed them over in silence. He unfolded the parchment, his eyes skimming the words, his lips twitching at the seals. The pause was too long. The silence stretched. Eliza's heart pounded, but her face remained composed, her gaze fixed not on him, but beyond him, as though he were beneath her notice. It was a small performance, but one Catherine had perfected. Arrogance as a shield. The clerk grunted, rubbing the paper between his fingers as though testing its weight. "Traveling alone, miss?" he asked finally, his tone shifting from suspicion to curiosity, laced with the hunger of a man who thinks a woman vulnerable. "Yes," Eliza said softly, her voice even. "My kin await me in St. Louis. The storm delayed me." Another pause, his eyes narrowed. Flick, king to her gloves, to the fine stitching of the cloak, to the faint lines of fatigue around her mouth. He was not a fool. He knew wealth when he saw it, and he also knew danger, because wealth unattended always drew questions. From behind, a voice cut through the wind. "You checking every lady like she's a thief, Mark?" A tall man approached, his gait loose with confidence, his coat dusted with snow. The captain, Eliza guessed, by the way the clerk's spine straightened. His eyes flicked to her, lingering a fraction too long, and in that moment she felt exposed, as though the river itself had turned to look. But the captain only smiled faintly. "Storms filled your head with suspicion," he muttered, plucking the papers from the clerk's hands. He scanned them briefly, then snapped them shut and handed them back to Eliza with a nod. "All looks proper. Welcome aboard, Miss Washington." Eliza inclined her head, every muscle taut with restraint. She stepped onto the gangway, the river shifting beneath her feet, the boat swallowing her into its belly of wood and smoke. Only when she reached the passenger cabin did she exhale. The papers had held, the mask had not cracked, but the danger was not gone. For as she set down her small bundle and listened to the chatter of travelers, planters, merchants, soldiers, gamblers, she heard it again, carried on a woman's whisper from across the room. "Did you hear? The Bellamys froze to death. Some say a witch did it, a slave girl who walked away in the storm, untouched." Eliza lowered her gaze, hiding the flicker in her eyes. The legend had traveled faster than she had, and now, aboard the River Queen, surrounded by strangers and suspicion, she realized the truth. Her greatest danger was no longer being hunted. It was being recognized by the myth she had unwillingly become. The riverboat shuddered as its great paddle wheels churned the black water, sending up sprays that froze instantly upon the railings. Inside the passenger cabin, heat from the iron stove pushed back the storm's bite, but the air was thick with tobacco smoke and murmurs of speculation. Every conversation carried fragments of the same story, reshaped with each telling, as though fear itself sought to keep the tale alive. The Bellamys, dead in their own icehouse. Some claimed it was suicide born of madness. Others whispered about demons lured by cruelty. But the version that spread most quickly was the one that clung to Eliza's skin like a curse. the runaway girl who had wielded the storm as her weapon. The Ice Witch of Natchez. Eliza sat near the corner, her hood low, her bundle pressed close. Every laugh, every whisper seemed sharpened to pierce her composure. Men exchanged knowing looks, as if savoring scandal. Women crossed themselves when the tale reached its darker embellishments. She kept her eyes lowered, adopting the posture of someone who belonged, yet wished not to be noticed. But invisibility is fragile on a riverboat. Too many eyes, too few corners. The gamblers noticed her first. 3 men, rough in manner, their hands heavy with rings, their laughter edged with cruelty. They watched her as one might watch a hand of cards yet to be revealed. One leaned forward, voice low but deliberate. Strange time for a lady to travel alone, don't you think? Eliza looked up just enough to meet his gaze. Strange storms demand strange journeys, she said, her tone calm, precise. The words silenced him for a moment, then drew laughter from his companions. They weren't sure if they'd been insulted or charmed. She had learned this balance from years of survival in the Bellamy house, say just enough to deflect, never enough to invite more. But the danger was not only in Joel Ambler's eyes. Across the cabin, a preacher in black watched her with a different scrutiny. His Bible lay open, his lips moving silently as if measuring her soul against Scripture. He had overheard the talk of witches, and she could feel his suspicion burn hotter than the stove. That night, as the boat rocked and the storm howled outside, Eliza lay awake in her berth, listening. The gamblers drank and argued in the saloon. The preacher's footsteps echoed down the corridor as he patrolled the decks like a hound sniffing for sin. Somewhere a child cried, and the sound cracked through her memory like ice splitting. She remembered the Bellamy twins' laughter, remembered Robert's cruelty, remembered the faces pressed against the Icehouse door as the lock turned, their eyes wide and frantic. The echo haunted her more than the whispers of strangers. Yet she felt no guilt, only clarity. Survival was never clean, freedom was never granted. It was taken, carved out from the marrow of suffering, and it demanded blood and silence both. By morning, the whispers on deck grew louder. A crewman had brought news from the Natchez docks. Slave hunters were already spreading through the region, their descriptions vague, but their intent clear. Find the missing girl, the one called Eliza, the one suspected of orchestrating the Bellamy deaths. The gamblers laughed again when they heard. A witch slave girl? If she's clever enough to pull that, I'd wager she's already long gone. But the preacher did not laugh. His eyes narrowed, scanning the cabin as though expecting to see the ghost of the Ice Witch seated among them. And in that moment, Eliza realized her greatest challenge was not outrunning the hunters. It was staying unnoticed among the fearful, for fear makes ordinary men dangerous. Fear makes them watch more closely than any hound. She adjusted her hood, her fingers brushing the forged papers inside her cloak. They would be tested again, perhaps soon. The Mississippi stretched northward like a vein of possibility, but it also carried rumors faster than any boat could travel, and those rumors, once they reached the wrong ears, could freeze her journey as surely as the Icehouse had claimed the Bellamys. The river carried her forward, but the myth carried her name ahead of her. By the 3rd day upriver, the storm had softened, but the cold lingered like a curse. Thin sunlight bled through grey clouds, painting the river in shifting silver. The River Queen pressed steadily northward, each churn of its paddle wheels carrying Eliza closer to freedom, but closer too to exposure. Because whispers do not fade, they sharpen, and whispers had begun to point at her. The preacher was the first to act. His name, she learned from a murmured conversation, was Reverend Josiah Pike, a man known across the river towns for his firebrand sermons against sin. His frame was gaunt but unyielding, his face long and hollowed by fasting, his eyes burning with a light that was less holy than hungry. He had been listening, always listening, and in the space between prayers and hymns, he studied her. That afternoon, as passengers gathered in the dining hall, he approached. His boots struck the wooden floor with deliberate force, each step like a gavel. The gamblers fell silent, sensing confrontation. Mothers pulled their children closer. Even the clerk, who had been pretending not to care, set down his ledger to watch. Reverend Pike stopped before Eliza's table. His shadow stretched long across the boards, reaching her feet like an omen. "You," he said, voice thin but sharp. "Where do you come from?" Eliza looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with the quiet steadiness she had learned in Catherine's house, the steadiness that had enraged her mistress because it could not be broken. "New Orleans," she said softly, sliding the forged papers from her cloak. "My name is Elizabeth Washington. I am traveling to St. Louis." She laid the documents on the table with precise calm, her movements measured, deliberate. The gamblers leaned forward. The preacher snatched the papers as though they carried contagion. He scanned them, lips moving, eyes narrowing at each line. "New Orleans," he muttered, skepticism dripping from the word. "A city of sin and corruption. And you, traveling alone, unescorted, in these times?" He raised his eyes, searching her face, searching for the slip, the tremor, the unmasking. Eliza's voice did not waver. "My family awaits me. The storm delayed me. Nothing more." The preacher's lips pressed thin, and for a long moment silence pressed down upon the room. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice so that only those nearest could hear, though his words carried like sparks in dry brush. "Tell me, Miss Washington, do you believe in witches?" The question hung in the air like frost. The gamblers chuckled nervously. A woman gasped. Eliza met his stare without flinching. "I believe men invent witches when they fear women they cannot control," she said, her tone edged with steel. "Scripture tells us to test all spirits, Reverend. Perhaps you should test your own." A ripple moved through the room, half shock, half respect. The preacher's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, he seemed on the verge of denouncing her, of raising his voice and branding her before them all. But he stopped. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the papers and returned them with a snap. "Be careful, Miss Washington," he said coldly. "Storms leave strange survivors." Then he turned sharply, his black coat billowing as he strode from the hall. The gamblers laughed outright now, slapping the table. "Well said, madam, well said," one cried, lifting his glass in toast. But their amusement was a danger in itself. Too much attention was as deadly as suspicion. Eliza reclaimed her papers and lowered her hood further, though inside she trembled, not from fear of the preacher, but from recognition. He had seen something, perhaps not enough to unmask her, but enough to plant a seed of doubt in every mind that had listened, and seeds, once planted, grow. That night, she lay awake again, listening to the groan of the riverboat timbers, the slap of water against the hull, and the preacher's voice echoing in her memory. "Be careful. Storms leave strange survivors." The river carried her onward, but every mile upriver tightened the noose of recognition. The myth of the ice witch was catching her, and now suspicion had a face. The fourth morning upriver dawned brittle and merciless. Frost clung to the railings like bone-white fingers, and the Mississippi rolled black beneath the pale sky. The River Queen slowed as it neared a riverside landing where a small crowd waited, but these were not merchants or families eager for passage. These were men with dogs, slave hunters. Their presence moved like a current through the passengers. Mothers hushed their children. The gamblers abandoned their cards. Even the preacher paused mid-prayer, his voice faltering as suspicion sharpened into anticipation. Everyone knew why the hunters had come. News traveled faster than riverboats. The Bellamy's deaths had already become legend, and the hunters were here to capture the shadow behind the legend. The vanished girl called Eliza. The captain shouted orders, his voice steady but taut. Lines were thrown, the boat tethered to the dock. 6 men boarded, thick coats, pistols at their hips, whips coiled at their sides. The dogs strained against their leashes, teeth bared, muzzles steaming in the cold. Their handler barked commands, and the animals lowered their heads, sniffing the air, pulling toward the crowd of passengers herded into the main hall. Eliza sat among them, cloak wrapped tight, her papers pressed against her breast like a shield. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, but her face remained still, unreadable. Years of surviving the Bellamy household had taught her the art of masks, and now the mask might save her life. The lead hunter stepped forward, his voice rough as gravel. "We seek a runaway girl. 17, light skin, sharp eyes. Goes by Eliza." He spat the name as though it were filth. "If you've seen her, speak. If you harbor her, you'll pay." Silence. Passengers shifted uneasily. The gamblers glanced at one another with sly amusement, but none spoke. The preacher, however, stood slowly, high, his bony hand raised like a judge about to deliver sentence. "I have heard tell," he said, voice solemn, "that such a girl walks among us." His eyes cut directly toward Eliza's corner. Her throat tightened, but her gaze remained level, waiting. The hunter's boots struck the floorboards as he crossed the room, dogs straining toward her. He stopped before her chair, looming, his breath a cloud of whiskey and meat. "Stand up," he growled. Eliza rose, cloak falling open just enough to reveal the fine dress she had taken from Catherine's chamber. She extended her hand, papers unfolded, voice steady. "Elizabeth Washington, from New Orleans, bound for St. Louis. My father was freed before me. My family waits upriver." The hunter snatched the parchment, eyes flicking over the script. His lips moved as he read, his brow furrowed. He turned the page, examined the seal, rubbed the ink with his thumb. Around him, silence deepened, every passenger watching. Breathless, the dogs circled, whining, noses brushing the hem of her cloak. One growled low, teeth flashing. The handler yanked the leash, muttering, "They smell something." The hunter's eyes lifted, meeting hers. They lingered there too long. She knew what he was measuring, not the words on the page, but the strength in her gaze, the stillness in her stance. Slaves were trained to lower their eyes, but Eliza did not lower hers. Finally, the hunter shoved the papers back into her hand. "She's no runaway," he muttered, though doubt edged his tone. "Papers check out. The witch girl's still south if she lives at all." Relief rippled through the cabin, but it was brittle, uncertain. Reverend Pike's lips tightened. The gamblers smirked, but their eyes glittered with curiosity, and Eliza, though her mask never cracked, felt the fire in her chest burn hotter. For she knew the truth. She had passed this test, but each mile upriver brought more hunters, more suspicion, more whispers carried ahead of her. As the hunters turned away, leading their dogs toward the next cluster of passengers, Eliza sat down slowly, tucking the papers into her cloak. She had survived, yes, but in survival, something else had been planted in those who watched. Not just suspicion, but fascination. And fascination could be just as deadly. The hunters disembarked, their dogs barking as they vanished into the frozen morning, and the River Queen pulled free from the landing. But the silence they left behind was heavier than the storm itself. Every passenger carried a new weight, a secret knowledge. One among them had stood trial under suspicion of being the Ice Witch of Natchez. One among them had not broken, and that one was Eliza. The gamblers, emboldened by the spectacle, grew bolder in their curiosity. They lingered near her corner, their laughter sharp as knives. "Quite the show you put on, Miss Washington," one said, his words honeyed with mockery. "Eyes steady as stone, tongue sharp enough to cut scripture. You'd clean out a card table faster than any of us." His companion leaned closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "I wonder, though. A lady traveling alone, dressed finer than most planters' wives, yet without an escort? That makes for a puzzle. And gamblers, you know, we can't resist puzzles." Eliza met their stares with a calm that masked the coil of dread beneath. She offered nothing, no hint of weakness, no thread for them to pull. Silence became her shield, yet she knew silence alone could not protect her forever. The preacher was the next to act. Reverend Pike cornered her on the deck as dusk fell, the river stretching out in endless shadow. He kept his distance, but his voice carried like a whip. "Those hunters did not see what I see," he said. "A mask well crafted, but masks always crack. God tests us, Miss Washington, and he reveals what lies beneath. When the time comes, your truth will burn through the paper you hide behind." Eliza turned her head, the wind pulling back her hood just enough for him to see her profile in the fading light. Her voice was low, steady. "Reverend, if you believe your God reveals truth, then perhaps you should wait for him to speak, instead of trying to speak for him." The words struck like a blade. Pike's jaw tightened. He looked as though he would strike her, but instead he spat into the river and stalked away, muttering scripture under his breath. Yet his shadow followed her, heavier than before. That night the captain himself sought her out. A man of broad shoulders and weary eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of one who had seen too many storms to fear them. He invited her to his cabin under the guise of checking her papers again, but Eliza sensed something else in his manner, something sharper than suspicion, more personal than authority. "You carry yourself like no passenger I've seen," he said, studying her as if she were a map. "Not a planter's daughter, not a merchant's wife. There's steel in you, girl, steel and silence. You know what they say of the Bellamys, that the storm itself rose against them, that a slave girl walked away untouched. Some call her a witch, some call her a saint. I call her dangerous." His eyes searched hers, testing, weighing. Eliza said nothing, only folded her hands in her lap and let the silence stretch. At last he leaned back, sighing. "Whatever your story, it's not mine to tell. I keep this boat running, not chasing phantoms. But be warned. Men chase ghosts with guns in these waters. And if they believe you're the Ice Witch, papers won't save you. Not forever." When he dismissed her, Eliza walked the narrow corridor back to her berth, her mind churning. She had survived the hunters, deflected the preacher, endured the gamblers, and drawn the captain's wary respect. But each encounter left marks, threads of suspicion, seeds of curiosity, and those threads were weaving into a net. The Mississippi was carrying her northward, yes, but it was also carrying her deeper into the legend, and legends, once born, cannot be silenced. By the sixth evening on the river, the gamblers had grown restless. Their coins clinked too softly on the table, their victories felt hollow, and their eyes kept straying toward the quiet figure in the corner, the woman who did not play, who did not laugh, who did not give them the satisfaction of reaction. Eliza. To men who thrived on wagers and risk, her silence became the richest prize. She was a riddle, and gamblers cannot resist riddles. They began with harmless gestures, offering her a seat at their table, inviting her to cut the cards, tossing careless compliments in her direction. Eliza declined each with a polite nod, her voice no more than a thread of sound. Then their tactics shifted. One evening they staged a quarrel over a bet, voices rising, fists pounding, until the crowd gathered. Then, in the sudden silence, one turned to Eliza. "You there, madam, settle this for us. What's the worth of a man's word when money's on the line?" Dozens of eyes fixed on her. A trap. If she refused, she would appear evasive. If she answered, she risked revealing too much. Eliza lifted her chin, her voice steady. "A man's word is worth no more than the silence he can keep, and silence, gentlemen, is priceless." The crowd chuckled. The gamblers exchanged looks, one muttering, "Sharp tongue indeed." But beneath their laughter was something harder, irritation at being bested by the woman they sought to corner. That night they changed the game again. Cards were laid out, dice rolled, wagers shouted. Then one gambler, tall, scarred across the cheek, leaned close to Eliza's seat, his tone low, conspiratorial. "You've got eyes like someone who's seen too much. Not a planter's daughter, not a merchant's widow. Something else. You wear secrets like a second skin. Now, what would a man pay to uncover those?" He tapped the stack of coins before him, smiling. The others laughed, raising their glasses. Yes, tell us a secret, Miss Washington. Just one. We'll make it worth your while." The room grew tense, the line between jest and menace blurring. They were not asking. They were demanding, cloaked in laughter. Eliza's heart hammered, but her face remained composed. She leaned forward just enough for her words to reach their ears, and no further. "Gentlemen, you gamble because you think fate owes you something. But fate is not a card to be drawn or a die to be rolled. Fate is the silence before the storm. And if you break it, the storm breaks you." Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. For a moment the gamblers froze, caught between awe and unease. The scarred man chuckled, though the sound rang hollow. Strange talk for a lady, almost witch's talk. The word cut the air. A few passengers glanced over, whispers stirring like leaves in wind. Eliza rose at once, her movements fluid, unhurried. She inclined her head slightly as though excusing herself from a tedious game, and withdrew to her berth. Behind her, laughter resumed, forced and uneasy. But the damage was done. The gamblers had turned their sport into accusation, and the word they had loosed, witch, would not easily be recalled. In the dark of her cabin, Eliza lay awake, her mind racing. Each test aboard this boat was tightening the snare. Not the hunters, not the preacher, not even the captain. It was the idle games of men that might undo her. And yet she felt something else stir within her chest, not fear, not dread, but the iron clarity of survival. If they wished to turn her into a witch, then perhaps she could wield that shadow, bend it, and make it her weapon. For silence was not only her shield, it could also be her storm. The gambler's jest had already spread like fire on dry wood. The witch-woman, they whispered. Some said it with mockery, others with unease, but all repeated it. The word clung to her name more tightly than her forged papers ever could. Eliza understood then. She could not erase the rumor. To fight it would draw more suspicion. To survive, she must let the story live, on her terms. She began subtly. On deck she walked the cold mornings alone, letting the river mist curl around her like a veil. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were chosen with precision, laced with calm certainty that unsettled those listening. When gamblers muttered, she let silence hang until it grew unbearable, then offered a phrase sharp enough to cut. Passengers began to avoid her path. Mothers drew children closer, yet some, those hungry for mystery, watched her with fascination, as if proximity to her shadow might grant them power. Even Reverend Pike faltered. He preached louder, railing against sin and witchcraft, but his eyes betrayed something else when they met hers. Fear. He had meant to expose her, but now the weight of the myth was greater than his sermons. And the captain, pragmatic as ever, allowed it to fester. He saw order maintained, no panic, no revolt, only a strange respect born of dread. Eliza felt it building, the transformation. They would not see her as Eliza, the fugitive girl. They would see her as the figure the river already carried ahead. The Ice Witch. Dangerous. Untouchable. And if danger made her untouchable, then perhaps she could ride the legend farther than any forged paper could carry her. The storm had given her a mask. Now she would learn to wear it. At first the legend was a shield. Men who once looked at her with hunger now lowered their gaze. Those who whispered her name did so with caution, as though the syllables themselves might conjure frost from the air. But power, real or imagined, never goes unnoticed for long. One evening, as the steamer moored at a bustling port, a figure boarded who carried authority like a second skin. Sheriff Dalton, known for hunting down fugitives with a brutality that made even slave traders uneasy. He had heard the whispers before he ever stepped aboard, a witch girl, a runaway cloaked in ice. Dalton was not the type to fear superstition. To him, fear was a tool, and this tale of the Ice Witch was a blade he might sharpen for himself. He began watching her, not with awe, but calculation. Every movement, every silence, every glance she gave became fuel for his suspicion. The other passengers, meanwhile, leaned into the myth more with each retelling. They began claiming strange things, frost forming where she walked, candles guttering when she passed, dreams filled with cold breath. Some even believed her silence could summon storms. The story grew monstrous, unrecognizable even to her. Eliza felt the shift. What had been protection was turning into a snare. Fear made people obey, but fear also made them lash out, eager to destroy what they could not control. Dalton approached her one night, tipping his hat with false courtesy, his eyes narrowing as though he could strip away every layer of her disguise. "Funny thing," he drawled, "how legends follow certain folks. Makes a man wonder if there's truth buried under the lies." In that moment, Eliza understood. The mask she had chosen was no longer just armor. It was bait. Sheriff Dalton wasted no time weaving his trap. He was a hunter by nature, and on the steamer he stalked her without chains, without shackles, only with questions sharpened to pierce through falsehood. At breakfast, he asked the captain about forged papers. At supper, he spoke of runaways who used fear to mask weakness. Always his gaze slid toward her, daring her to flinch. The passengers, already half in awe and half in terror of the Ice Witch, now found a new fascination, watching predator and phantom circle one another. Some whispered that Dalton would expose her, that he would drag her back to Natchez in irons. Others insisted no mortal man could capture what was not entirely human. The tension became its own theatre. Eliza played her part carefully. She met Dalton's eyes without trembling, answering his thinly veiled interrogations with words clipped and cold, every syllable chosen not to explain, but to unsettle. If he pressed too far, she let silence hang until the air itself seemed to freeze. Yet in the privacy of her cabin she felt the walls tightening. He was methodical, and method broke even the strongest illusions. Sooner or later he would demand proof, not whispers, and her forged documents, though convincing, would not withstand his scrutiny for long. That night, as the steamer's paddle wheels throbbed against the black water, she faced the crossroads. She could attempt to vanish again, slip off at the next port, risk the wilderness, start the flight anew, or she could embrace the very myth that threatened to consume her, using it not just as a mask, but as a weapon sharp enough to wound Dalton himself. The hunter had marked her. Now she would decide whether to run or to become the storm he feared. Eliza knew men like Dalton feared only two things: failure and the unknown. If she could blur the line between them, she might survive. So, she crafted a theater of fear. The night was her ally, the river cloaked in mist, the deck lit by lanterns that flickered under the wind. She slipped from her cabin carrying a vial of lamp oil, a flint, and shards of crushed river ice she had gathered secretly. When Dalton prowled the deck, she waited in shadow. Then, with a deliberate scrape of flint, she coaxed the lantern nearest him to flare. The oil-soaked wick spat flame and hissed, sparks showering as the mist thickened around his boots. She scattered the ice into the light so it glittered like falling frost, and in the half-dark, it seemed as though the air itself froze in her presence. The gamblers gasped. One woman crossed herself. Dalton froze, his confidence faltering for the first time, as if the rumor had reached out and touched him. Eliza spoke, her voice calm, low but sharp enough to carry. "Some prisons have no bars, Sheriff, only walls of ice. Ask yourself, when it closes around you, who will hold the key?" The silence that followed was electric. The passengers believed. Dalton's jaw tightened, but his hand drifted from his holster, as though a sudden chill made even iron feel fragile. She had not proven herself a witch, but in that moment she had proven herself untouchable. Dalton was not a man easily shaken. The display unsettled him, yes, but it also enraged him. Fear was a tool he thought he alone controlled. For a runaway girl to wield it against him before an audience was an insult he could not leave unanswered. By the next morning, he began planting seeds of doubt. At breakfast, he laughed loudly, telling anyone who would listen that trickery was as old as the devil himself. "Smoke and mirrors," he said, slapping the table. "You'd be fools to think cold mist makes a witch." His voice carried, turning unease into skepticism. Some passengers wavered. The gamblers muttered that maybe she was nothing more than a cunning runaway, clever enough to spin superstition into safety. A few nodded, relieved to reduce their fear to something manageable, yet others still eyed her warily, caught between belief and disbelief, the perfect breeding ground for chaos. Dalton leaned into this division, working the crowd like a preacher. "A real witch," he mocked, staring straight at her. "If she had power, she'd use it, but notice, her chill vanishes when watched too close." His smirk was venom, daring her to break her mask. But Eliza did not answer. She let the silence linger, her gaze fixed on him until others looked away first. She understood. The more he attacked, the more desperate he appeared. His fury was becoming its own kind of testimony. The legend lived on, but now it burned hotter, sharper, no longer just protection, but a duel. By the third night, Dalton's restraint had unraveled. He was no longer content to circle his prey with words. He wanted blood, and he wanted the legend broken in front of witnesses. He chose his moment carefully. The steamer had stopped at a lonely stretch of riverbank to take on wood. Lanterns threw harsh light against the fog, and passengers lingered on deck, restless, expectant. Dalton strode forward, hand resting on his revolver, his voice carrying over the water's hush. "This ends tonight," he declared. "No more shadows, no more whispers. If she is flesh, she will bleed. If she is smoke, she will vanish. Either way, we'll have truth." A murmur swept the crowd. Some backed away, unwilling to be part of whatever storm was coming. Others leaned in, hungry for spectacle. The gamblers, always betting on survival, whispered odds on whether the witch would live to see dawn. Dalton pointed at her papers, demanding they be inspected by the captain himself. His eyes gleamed with triumph. Here was the trap, the official noose hidden inside law. If the papers faltered, no legend could save her. But Eliza did not flinch. She stepped forward into the lantern light, her presence commanding every movement deliberate. The mist curled around her like a cloak. Her eyes, cold and steady, locked on Dalton's. "You want truth?" she said softly, but the deck carried her words to every ear. "Then you'll find it, not in the ink of papers, but in the frost that waits for men like you." The duel was no longer hidden. It was here on open deck, with the river itself holding its breath. The air thickened as if the river itself paused to listen. Dalton's hand hovered near his revolver, but the crowd's eyes weren't on him anymore. They were on her. Eliza stood unmoving, wrapped not in chains, but in the weight of their belief. The captain stepped forward, papers in hand, his brow furrowed, scanning the forged signatures, the seals copied with such precision they bled authority. After a long silence, he lifted his gaze. "These appear in order," he said carefully. "As far as I see, this woman travels lawfully." A ripple ran through the passengers. Some exhaled in relief. Others whispered that no forged ink could explain the frost still clinging to the lantern glass. Dalton snarled, furious, but even he felt the shift. To press further now would not just expose Eliza, it would expose himself as the man who feared her. Power in the eyes of others is fragile, and he sensed it slipping from his grasp. Eliza tilted her head, calm, unyielding. "The truth," she murmured, "is not yours to command." The sheriff's hand fell from his holster. He turned sharply, retreating to shadow, his hunt undone, not by bullets or chains, but by a myth he could not kill. By dawn, the steamer pulled into the next port. Passengers swore they saw her disembark, disappearing into the fog. Others swore she never stepped ashore at all. What remained certain was this: the Ice Witch of Natchez had not been captured. She had become untouchable, a name carried forever by the river's dark waters.